Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. Diep's life changes when she finds a lost little girl named Nee and rescues her from two suspicious strangers. Taking Nye home out of compassion, Diep soon faces new challenges, caring for the child, enduring the weight of loneliness, and missing James deeply. At the market and on the farm, Diep struggles to balance survival with the responsibility of protecting Nye. Whispers from villagers and the men's return test her courage. Yet Nye's presence brings unexpected strength and comfort. In saving the girl, Diep also finds a new purpose, and together they face uncertainty with hope. Stay with us until the end to see how their fragile bond grows into strength. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 500 followers. Your support means so much. Dust rose in spirals beneath the blistering noon sun as Diep slowed her steps. The faint, trembling sound of a child's cry drifted through the roadside air, sharp and out of place in the quiet. She turned her head, and there, just beyond the weeds near a narrow path, was a little girl. Nee, small, fragile, her hair messy, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears, sat huddled, knees pulled tightly to her chest. Diep's heart clenched instantly. She crouched down, her voice gentle, almost breaking with concern. "Sweetheart, why are you here alone? Where's your mother?" The girl lifted her head, eyes swollen from crying. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Mom's name is Chiyu. I waited for her, but she never came back." The raw loneliness in those few words struck Diep like a blow. Something in Nee's tone mirrored her own quiet ache, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting safety could be. Reaching out her hand, Diep said softly, "Don't worry, I'll help you." But as she glanced up from the girl, Diep's gaze sharpened. Just a few paces away, two unfamiliar men were leading Nye by the arm. Their movements hurried, their faces tense. Diep's instincts flared with alarm. Something was wrong. She called out, voice steady but firm. "Wait, where are you taking this child?" The men froze, exchanged glances, then muttered, "We're helping her find her mother." Their tone was flat, unconvincing. Diep's eyes narrowed. Everything in her told her this was not safe. With quiet resolve, she stepped closer, placing herself between Nye and the men. "Then you won't mind if I bring her to the police myself," she said. The men hesitated, their eyes flickering with unease. For a tense moment, it felt like the air itself held its breath. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, they turned and walked away, their figures disappearing down the dusty road. Diep exhaled shakily, then knelt to Nee again. "You're safe now. Come with me." Nee's tiny hand reached for hers, clinging with surprising strength. That fragile grip was more than trust. It was a silent plea. Diep led the child first to the local staff office, hoping someone would know of her family. Inside the cramped room, she explained Nee's story. An older man scratched his head and shook it. "There's no one named Chiu in this village. I'm sorry." Diep glanced down at Nee. The girl's eyes brimmed with fresh tears, her little body trembling with fear. Diep bent down, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Would you like to come with me for now, until we can find your mother?" Nee nodded, gripping her hand tighter. The choice pierced Diep's heart. Taking responsibility for this child would not be easy. Her own life was already stretched thin with worry for James, with the struggles of the farm, with the loneliness she carried. Yet leaving Nye behind was unthinkable. So Diep made her decision. Together, they stepped back into the blazing sun, walking toward the farm. Nye clung to her side like a fledgling seeking shelter. Each step pressed heavy responsibility onto Diep's shoulders, but also kindled a fragile light in her chest. The market later that afternoon buzzed with noise. Sellers called out prices. Buyers haggled. The smell of fresh produce and grilled food filled the air. Diep stood at her stall with melons arranged neatly in a row, their skin gleaming under the sunlight. Nye, standing close beside her, watched eagerly. "Melons, sweet melons, 10,000 a kilo," Diep called out, her voice bright, though her eyes held worry. Nye mimicked her, chirping in her small, playful voice. "Melons are yummy. Buy some, sister." Her innocence drew smiles from passers-by. One woman stopped, took a slice to taste, and smiled approvingly. "Sweet indeed. I'll take 2 kilos." As Diep weighed the melons and accepted the coins, her heart felt a small flicker of hope. Each kilo sold was progress, a reminder that she could still keep moving forward. Yet beneath the surface, the weight of caring for Nye pressed on her, mingling with the constant ache of missing James. At one point, Nye tried to lift a melon herself, her little arms wobbling under the weight. She dropped it with a thud, startled, then looked up at Diep. Instead of scolding, Diep chuckled and ruffled her hair. "Good effort, but let's be more careful, okay?" Nye grinned shyly, her smile like a cool breeze in the sweltering heat of the market. That single moment eased some of Diep's burden, even if only briefly. But when a customer casually asked, "Are these your own farm's melons?" Diep froze for a second. The truth stung. This was only cheap land, far from the dream she and James had once shared. The reminder made her chest tighten. As the market thinned out, Diep counted her coins, each clink of metal echoing louder than the bustle around her. She carried not just money, but the fragile hope of providing for the small girl beside her. "Teacher, I'm hungry," Nye whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Diep smiled gently, though her heart ached. "Don't worry, I'll cook us something good." Dusk settled as they left the market, the sky painted in strokes of orange and purple. By the time they reached Diep's small home, the first stars were flickering faintly above. Inside, a dim oil lamp glowed, filling the modest room with warm light. Nye sat at the wooden table, swinging her legs, eyes fixed on Diep as she prepared dinner. "Hungry yet?" Diep asked softly while chopping Malabar spinach. The girl nodded, but when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with longing. "Teacher, where's my mom?" The knife in Diep's hand paused mid-cut. Her chest tightened, as though the question was directed to her own buried wounds. She forced her voice steady. "I told the police. They'll do everything to find her. You're not alone." The words felt weak, but they were the only comfort she could give. Later, as Diep bathed Nye in warm water, she tried to distract her with gentle chatter, but nothing could wash away the yearning in the child's eyes. Over dinner, Nye refused the meat, only sipping soup. Diep coaxed her with a smile. "Eat more, or I'll have to fatten you up myself." The words were playful, yet beneath them was the heavy truth. Diep didn't know if she had the strength to carry this new responsibility. Still, she hid her worries behind encouragement, choosing hope for the little girl who now leaned on her. Night deepened. After the meal, Diep sat beside Nee under the lamp's glow. Their shadows stretched across the wall, two small figures bound by shared solitude. "I've missed loved ones too," Diep murmured, almost to herself. Nee leaned against her, small and fragile, seeking warmth. Diep wrapped her arms around the child, a silent vow rising inside her, to shield this girl, no matter the storms. Outside, the wind whispered through the night, carrying the weight of uncertainty. Inside, the small home held two souls, both lost, both searching, finding comfort, at least for now, in each other's presence. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the oil lamp. Diep sat quietly, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Suddenly, the sharp buzz of her phone startled her. She reached for it, hands trembling slightly. James's voice came through, tired but warm. "I just finished a meeting. Everything's fine here." Diep exhaled, relief washing over her like a tide. Her body sank into the chair, as if some invisible burden had lifted, if only for a moment. "I was so worried. Just hearing your voice makes me feel better," she admitted, her tone unsteady, betraying the storm of emotions she had been holding in. James asked softly, "And how's the farm? How are you managing?" Diep hesitated, glancing at Nee curled up nearby, her small chest rising and falling as she drifted into sleep. "There's something I need to tell you," Diep whispered. "I found a little girl, lost on the roadside. Her name is Nee. She said she was waiting for her mother, but two men tried to take her. I couldn't just stand by. I brought her here." On the other end, James was silent for a beat before replying with gentle reassurance. "You did the right thing. I believe you can care for her until her family is found." Those words flickered like a candle flame in Diep's heart, fragile yet warm. "I'm trying, but it's not easy," she confessed. "I don't know if I can give her what she needs." "You're stronger than you think," James said. Diep swallowed back tears. She wanted to believe him, to trust that strength was something she could summon when needed. Hanging up the phone, she turned to Nye. The child had stirred, eyes damp with unshed tears. "Teacher, I miss my mom," Nee whispered. Diep knelt beside her, pulling her close. "Don't cry. I'm waiting for someone important too," she murmured, her voice heavy with longing. In the stillness of the house, their breaths and heartbeats mingled, a fragile bond forming in the quiet. Two lives, both yearning, both searching, clung to one another as though the other was the only anchor in a restless sea. The following days unfolded like a test of endurance. Diep woke early to tend to the small patch of land she cultivated, her hands rough with labor. Nye often trailed behind, imitating her, sometimes more of a help, other times a distraction. One morning, as the rooster crowed, Diep was repairing a section of the fence when she heard Nee's playful laugh. She turned and saw the girl running clumsily with a bucket of water, spilling half of it with each step. Diep couldn't help but smile despite her exhaustion. "Careful, Nye. You'll drown the soil before the plants." Nee giggled, dropping the bucket with a splash, then rushed over to hug Diep's leg. The embrace, innocent and warm, filled the hollow space James's absence had left. For a brief second, the farm felt alive again, but reality always found its way back. At the market, whispers followed them. Strangers glanced at Diep with curiosity, some with suspicion. Who was this child? Why was she always with her? One woman muttered under her breath, "She probably picked her up just for sympathy." The sting of those words cut deep. Diep straightened her back, ignoring the judgment, focusing only on Nee's tiny hand clutching hers. Later, as they sat eating simple rice and vegetables by the roadside, Nee asked innocently, "Why do people look at us like that?" Diep forced a smile. "Because they don't understand. But we know the truth, don't we? We're looking after each other." Nee nodded solemnly, and Diep felt a surge of determination. Whatever others thought didn't matter. Protecting this child did. One evening, as the sky turned crimson, Diep noticed Nee sitting quietly by the doorway, tracing shapes in the dust with her finger. "What are you drawing?" Diep asked, kneeling beside her. Nye looked up, her eyes glistening. "I'm drawing my mom, so I won't forget her face." The simple statement pierced Diep's heart. She pulled Nee into her arms, whispering, "You won't forget. And until you see her again, I'll be here." That night, when Nye finally fell asleep, Diep sat awake, her thoughts churning. She had faced many hardships before, but this was different. Caring for Nye wasn't just about providing food or shelter. It was about guarding the fragile hope of a child who had already lost too much. Diep stared at the flickering lamp, a silent promise forming in her chest. No matter how heavy the burden, she would not let Nye slip through the cracks of fate. But fate always had its tests. One afternoon, as Diep returned from gathering vegetables, she spotted two figures near the edge of the farm. Her breath caught. It was the same two men she had confronted days earlier. They lingered at a distance, watching. Diep's pulse raced. She pulled Nee behind her, shielding the girl with her body. Her voice was steady but fierce. "What are you doing here?" The men smirked, one of them muttering, "Just passing by. Don't be so protective." Diep didn't move. Her eyes locked on theirs until they finally turned and disappeared down the path. When they were gone, Nye clung to Diep's waist, trembling. "They scare me," she whispered. Diep stroked her hair. "Don't worry, I won't let them take you." Inside, though, her own fear gnawed at her. What if they returned? What if she couldn't stop them next time? That night, she sat awake long after Nye had fallen asleep, listening to every sound outside. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of wind through the trees. Each noise made her heart jolt. But alongside the fear came an unshakable determination. She had rescued Nye once. She would do it again if she had to. Days bled into weeks. Diep grew thinner, her hands more calloused, but her spirit burned stronger. With each sunrise, she rose not just for herself, but for the child who now called her teacher with unwavering trust. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Diep allowed herself to imagine what it would be like when James finally returned. Would he be surprised to see Nye there? Would he understand? She hoped he would see the same light she saw in the girl's smile, the same strength she had drawn from her presence. And though uncertainty clouded the future, one truth became clear. In finding Ni, Diep had not just saved a child, she had saved a part of herself. The girl's laughter softened her loneliness. Her tears gave Diep reason to fight harder. And her hand in Diep's own was a vow neither had spoken aloud, yet both believed in. They would not face the world alone anymore. The sun dipped below the horizon one more time, painting the sky in streaks of gold. Diep and Ni stood outside the small home, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dark. "Teacher," Ni said softly, "thank you for finding me." Diep's throat tightened. She knelt, pulling the child into her arms. "And thank you for staying with me." In that embrace, beneath the endless sky, the weight of uncertainty didn't vanish, but it no longer felt unbearable. Together, they had found a fragile refuge, a bond strong enough to stand against the shadows that lingered beyond the farm's edges. Whatever tomorrow brought, Diep knew one thing. She would fight for Ni, just as fiercely as she longed for James. Two lost souls, bound by fate, walking side by side toward an uncertain dawn.